Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening, and welcome to News from Neptune for the 25th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussant tonight is David Green. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it'll sound like you're coming from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misrepresented, occasionally even innocently, and then having our colleague comment on them. Today is June 20th. It's Midsummer Eve, the night before the summer solstice. Edward de Vere wrote in his play, set at that time of year, lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies, that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet, all are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than hell can hold, that is the madman. The lover, all is frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such tricks hath strong imagination that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. Or in the night imagining some fear, how easy is a bush supposed a bear. You're watching News from Neptune, the Midsummer Eve's edition, where we don't suppose bush a bear, while we contemplate America's ongoing war in the Mideast, now being deceptively prosecuted by Barack Obama's terrorism. And we'll begin with David Green. David, anything interesting in the news this week?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm open to suggestion and prodding and whatever in terms of what you might like to discuss on this rare two-person show. It certainly is.
We are spontaneous and unrehearsed.
Yes, so. And I think the most immediate thing has to do with the sending of troops to Iraq and the President Obama, justifying that, and a little weak response from the Congress in terms about, a congresswoman from Hawaii that I saw on TV this morning saying that it should be voted on. I guess I'm reminded, I've written a column in the last weekend that maybe will be in the paper this weekend or next weekend. Uh-huh. And one of the references has to do with a paper by a scholar named Michael J. Glennon about what he called double governments, which was from a British theorist in the 19th century named Walter Bagehot.
Yeah, Bagehot, sure.
And he talks about how foreign policy isn't, he makes a distinction between what he calls the Madisonian government, that is the constitutional government, and what he calls the Trumanite government, which was implemented after World War II. Mm-hmm. And he makes an argument in 114 double-spaced pages, which was in something called the Harvard's, something you wouldn't ordinarily read, called the Harvard Security Review or some such thing, in which is quite a magnificent scholarly paper with lots of good references and lots of good history. Shouldn't really be that daunting to anyone on that basis, which can be accessed online, but he kind of comes up with this idea of the Trumanite government, originating with people like, during the Truman era and the NSA Dean Acheson and all the people who gave us the modern era, gave us the world in which America was dominant, the American century. And so he talks about how it isn't just that the president isn't accountable, it's that there's this national security establishment, a law unto itself, with tens of thousands of people working in the Pentagon and various other agencies related to that, with very little, if any, accountability to either not just to the citizens, but the Madisonian government, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the president himself. So that I think it just provides a good perspective on how undemocratic our country has become. It has long since become that. It's never been democratic in the literal sense of the word, but now we see this, these events being moved forward, and Obama feeling like he has to respond in this way, and what good that could possibly do. I mean, what our interests, what he perceives our interest as being at this point. There is a lot of conspiracy theorizing going on Counterpunch these days by Mike Whitney and perhaps other people, saying that what our government really wants, what Obama really wants, is for ISIS, the Islamic movement of Iraq and Syria, to actually be successful in overthrowing the government of both Iraq and Syria, and ultimately Iran. So it's being connected to this kind of Sunni, this alignment with the kind of radical Sunni agenda in the Middle East, which would be more related to what the Saudis really want. So there's a lot to sort out.
Yeah.
So I would just throw that out there, just to see what your views are, or how you're approaching this.
Well, there seems to be, I mean, there's no end of room for investigation and speculation over against the account we're getting from the U.S. media, which I think is at least as misleading as was the case in the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq in 2003. The notion, the sort of the good thing about the sort of conspiracist talk that we're getting from Mike Whitney and the sorts of things that Counterpunch, I agree with you, with its Catholicity, lowercase c, in politics, its willingness to publish a variety of views, even of people who are considered suspect within the allowable limits of debate. The problem, or the virtue of this, seems to me, is that it raises the question of what is really going on. What is the United States really doing? And when we realize that the principal task of the American government is to misrepresent to the American public what it is really doing, this is a particularly important question to raise. What are they doing, and why do they feel it's so necessary to misrepresent it? Well, for all the talk about what American administrations have done throughout this decade, or back to the beginning of to the invasion of Iraq, or the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the American policy remains one that's actually consistent back to the Second World War. After the Second World War, the U.S., in surveying the world, which to its, not entirely to its surprise, it was essentially in charge of, the U.S. is the only damaged country coming out of World War II, was really calling the tune around the world and was consciously producing policies that would try to do that, to make sure that the rebuilding of of Europe went in the direction of the capitalist order and not in the direction of the socialist models that were found elsewhere and so forth. U.S. policy is quite consistent, not just since 1945, but as we've mentioned here before, even before that. But at the center of this policy from 1945 on has been control of energy resources. Middle East energy resources was the world's greatest material prize, said the State Department in 1945. And American policy, whether it's policy vis-a-vis China or the Soviet Union or the modern states of Europe, always had a concern for Middle East energy resources in the middle of it, because by controlling Middle East energy resources, the U.S. exercised a control over all those economies which depended upon those resources. I think what we've seen in these recent events in the Middle East is simply the working out of this ongoing policy, which remains essentially the same in whether administrations are Republican or Democrat. Specific decisions, whether, for example, to invade Iraq in 2003 or in 1991, these things remain a matter, as it were, of choice. But the overall policy, the goals the U.S. is pursuing, are the goals of the American 1%, the control of the world economy. And that has been absolutely consistent to the Second World War, and we can't begin talking about American policy unless we begin with what its object is, what it's trying to do.
So the question becomes one of tactics, and
exactly
what Mike Whitney is saying, that one tactic might be to ally, for the United States to ally itself with those forces, those minority forces within Iraq, but which are becoming very, very powerful within the oil-rich regions of that country, and to basically implement a permanent sort of partition of that country, which was really not a country anyway until like the 1920s, in which the Brits pieced it together. And the other tactic, which is being, I think, more played up in the media, is the fact that America arrives at the point where it has to ally itself in some way with our mortal enemy, with the axis of evil, Iran, in order to maintain the Shiite-supported government in Baghdad. But also, I guess the name that keeps popping into my head in the last day or two is that of Neo Zin Ziem.
I had exactly the same feeling.
Deposed by, is it ready, is Maliki ready to go the route of Ziem in 1963 to have the CIA signal that it's time to put a bullet into this guy's head.
Right.
And,
as they did for Ziem.
Yes, exactly. And quote unquote move forward. So and so we have Ahmed Chalabi showing up
of
on
all
the news.
people, you're
the
right.
people, this man who will not go away in spite of the fact that he has no support. But Ziem didn't really have much support. I think it was Chalabi that reminded me most of Ziem in the sense of which guy is it that we want to be governing this country?
It's definitely zombie time, isn't it?
Yeah.
All these people are walking once again.
Yeah.
No, it's a very good point. I mean, just to make clear, I mean, for those who came in late, Ziem...
like in 1980.
Yeah, that's right. We're born in this generation, maybe. Ziem was the ruler of South Vietnam during the Kennedy administration. And the parallels with Maliki in Iraq, right now in the Obama administration, are very great. And this is another example where our simplistic distinctions between factions in the American political class, Republicans and Democrats and so forth, obscures the fact that there is a vast continuity in American policy, and indeed in American, even in American tactics, because the murder of Ziem, which the Kennedy administration arranged because he wasn't doing the job that he had been put in place to do, that is running South Vietnam for us, should be a caution, should be a warning to Maliki. They'll kill you if you don't do what they want you to do in Washington. Maliki certainly knows that perfectly well. He's not stupid. He's vicious, apparently, and is probably, at the moment, looking for hidey holes that will allow him to avoid the fate of Ngo Diem Diem and Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, I think it's important to reflect on what the sectarian nature of this conflict is. I mean, the British like to put minorities in power so that the minorities would ally with them. And that doesn't literally apply to
That's a very good point, though.
Saddam Hussein. But the reason, Saddam Hussein was controllable because he represented a minority within his own country. Not that he didn't get along with the Shiite leadership of this country. I noticed on one of the news reports, on one of the commentaries the other day, that somebody pointing out, in fact, that out of the deck of cards that we were going after in the wake of our invasion of Iraq in 2003, it was actually 54, which the number that was being used, I assume, includes two.
We knew the U.S. would stack the deck.
Two jokers, that something like 35 of those were actually Shiite. It wasn't like they were all Sunni. It wasn't like they were all Saddam Hussein's brothers from Tikrit. But the point is that that wasn't, Saddam's control of Iraq wasn't on the basis of a Sunni Shia sectarian divide in the sense that we know it now, and in the sense that we know it now among the broader Middle East, where Saudi Arabia and Iran kind of figurehead these two aspects of Muslim culture. But that's the world that we have created, that we have helped to create in the Middle East in the last 40 years. Nobody knew about Sunnis and Shias before Lebanon in the 1970s, and it wasn't a factor in Iraq pretty much up to the end up to our invasion in 2003. People we know locally will tell you, who are from Iraq, will tell you that people didn't recognize each other that way in Iraq prior to 2003, but they do now. And that's what the reality that has to be dealt with now. So that's going to determine. I mean, it's still a tactical one. It isn't that Iraq is divided ideologically between the Sunni and Shia Islam. It's that there's been, since 2003, there's been an ethnic cleansing where it's been us here, them there. Increasingly, the Sunnis were driven into what are now the Sunni portions of the country, and the Shiites the same. So that's what we're dealing with now in deciding whether to ally ourselves in some way, in some pragmatic way or other, with Iran, or with the Sunni militants or the jihadists, let's say, in Iraq. And it certainly wouldn't be the first time that we've allied ourselves with Iran for pragmatic reasons, even as the axis of evil goes on, or whatever's left of the axis of evil. I guess since Iraq was part of the axis of evil, now there's only Iran and North Korea left in that.
The axis is spinning out of control.
Getting pretty thin. Pretty thin.
Yeah. I was interested in Obama's comment the other day in his news conference. He was asked a peculiar question that needs to be decoded. Which did he think was the greatest threat, Sunni extremism or Shia extremism? Very interesting way to put the question, because as you suggest, the distinction as a political reality was really produced by the United States. Right. Obama's example was to say, I don't like Sunni extremism and I don't like Shia extremism. And we have to realize we're in an Orwellian world where words take on only new symbolic uses. Extremism. What does extremism mean? Extremism means opposing the will of the United States, particularly in arms, that is, fighting back against American imperialism in the Middle East. And the fact that it should be talked about in terms of these major religious divisions of Islam is itself an artifact of American policy in two particular waves, a long wave from the 1960s and a recent wave from the really from the generalship of General Petraeus in Iraq. I heard more comments in the press in the last couple of days about, well, the U.S. stabilized the situation in Iraq when General Petraeus led the surge. Now, this is sort of this is propaganda of a fairly high order that needs to be demystified once again. The notion that the surge, that is, the military attacks that the U.S. Produced in Iraq in 2007 and their co-option of some of the Sunni resistance was a brilliant military stroke by General Petraeus is absolute nonsense. It's hogwash. I mean, what happened in Iraq in 2007, 2006, and 2007, which we don't mention at all, and only the excellent British correspondent Patrick Coburn seems to be writing about it in the English language press, was a vicious civil war between groups that were more or less identified with those two branches of Islam, but actually represented class and social divisions, class and regional divisions, as it were, within Iraq. It was a civil war that the U.S. constructed and promoted. Divide et impera, divide and conquer, is the imperialist oldest maxim, perhaps, going back at least to Rome. The U.S. policy after the difficulties that the Bush invasion of Iraq ran into was to divide and conquer its possible opposition by playing on this division, which you point out quite rightly, really was not a significant division whatsoever within Iraq before the U.S. got there and began arming one community against the other, playing on these local animosities, even to the point perhaps of staging an attack on the Shia holy place in Samarra, which is once again emerging as a symbol of the resistance. But the Petraeus, for all his self-promotion, wasn't even being very original here in trying to produce what was in fact quite a vicious civil war. The U.S., going back to at least the 1960s, had tried to counter secular Arab nationalism, as we might say, that is the nationalist concerns of the old states of the Ottoman Empire, by suppressing the political groups that might do it, people associated, for example, with Nasser's Egypt, and encouraging the transformation of these nationalist sentiments into religious sentiments. The religion became the collecting vessel for the destroyed Arab nationalism. And it had, of course, an ally in this, in that the U.S. chose Israel as its primary client in the Middle East from the 1960s simply because they had the best military. And they were the ones that could produce the sort of military occupation of the Middle East that U.S. policy had been interested in all along. So when the divide and rule strategy comes to Iraq in the first decade of this century, the U.S. once again has learnt nothing and forgotten nothing and has continued to do what it has all along and has produced a vicious situation for its own purposes. I mean, long gone is the notion of establishing a democratic Iraq or anything of that sort. I mean, the only people who believe that are the editorial writers for the New York Times. The rest of the world knows perfectly well what's going on here and what the U.S. is doing. But the now forgotten 2006-2007 civil war in Iraq, which established the conditions for the U.S. to produce a puppet government there, was a product of American tactics in the long-term strategy that they were involved with, and in some sense still exists as a cover story for the real national rivalries in the region, such as the rivalry between American clients, Saudi Arabia, and Iran.
Yeah. So once you establish this idea that, we made mistakes, but now we're sort of coming to the rescue of this quasi-democratic government in a certain way, I get the sense, and I'm not even saying I'm following all this that closely, but I just get the sense that the liberal media, the New York Times and so forth, and not just that, but a kind of consensus, including even people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham and all the people that usually oppose Obama on whatever he does in terms of foreign policy. I think there's going to be this sort of consensus that Obama is sort of being a cool customer and playing his hand and doing it cautiously. He's not going to make any of the mistakes that were done in the past, but he's going to send in a few people to try to help out a little bit, and he's going to get bipartisan support on this. And of course, given the reference that I made earlier in the show about the Trumanite government as opposed to the Madisonian government, that he's really, what he's doing here is really acceding to the wishes and necessities of what our foreign policy simply has to be. We have to do something in this context. It's not going to be a full-scale war or full-scale commitment of troops. And he's going to get bipartisan support for that, and he's going to get brownie points for that in terms of the foreign policy establishment as sort of carefully gauging what the response should be.
Are there any Madisonians left around? I mean, we're all Trumanites now, aren't we?
I mean, it's that's like, it's just sort of what I was thinking when I heard the Congresswoman from Hawaii on Amy Goodman this morning. Sort of like, well, what, that's nice, and it sounds like she was asked a kind of strange question about being Buddhist, but by Amy Goodman,
Amy's on a trip, isn't she?
But not that I'm not all for having. I mean, we should have 435 Buddhists in Congress. If you did have 435 Buddhists in Congress, I'm not sure if the foreign policy would change. That's the
exactly.
point.
That's the important
you've
point.
got
I think you're right.
You've got Christians and Jews. I mean, what are the Christians?
Well, one less Jew now.
Right. So, and we needed, you need a cantor in every synagogue too. But
we were referring to one less Jew as referring to the defeat of Eric Cantor as the House Majority Leader, but apparently his retirement from Congress as a result, which is consummation devoutly to be wished, but the last case may be worse than the first, so we really don't know. But back to the notion, and it's a good one that you introduced, between Madisonian, that is roughly constitutional government, and Trumanite government. I think we should be aware, first of all, that we're not dealing with what the psychologists might call primitive splitting, the good guys on one side, the bad guys on the other. An analysis of the Madisonian Constitution, James Madison being the primary architect of the 1787 Constitution, as it existed in the 18th century, is worthwhile to do, to see what had happened to that Constitution through the 20th century is also valuable. But the distinction that those terms are used, or the distinction they refer to in the summary David gave earlier, seems to me important here because it's part of the national propaganda. Obama says the other day he doesn't need congressional approval to introduce military actions, i.e. to kill people in Iraq, because after all he has the 2001 authorization for the use of military force and the 2003 authorization for the use of military force in Iraq. Now, this is very interesting. This is anti-Madisonian. The Constitution says that the president cannot exercise his role as commander-in-chief without authorization by Congress. Obama says he has that authorization when any reasonable reading of the documents would say that he doesn't. But we don't find, for the most part, many Madisonians standing up and saying, look, you're in the tradition of ignoring the Constitution that does at least go back to the Second World War, and probably, in many ways, to the First. The only person I hear in the American political discourse who's saying that is Ron Paul. And occasionally his son, if his son got out of the right side of bed that morning, or assumes it's going to be helpful
the right side of bed, so to speak. Yes.
Well, so to speak, or assume, more importantly, when he got out of bed, assume that it was going to be helpful for his presidential campaign. Rand Paul is not the, how to put this delicately, not the man of principle that his father is, or his father's principles, which we might also argue about in some ways, at least includes a certain Madisonianism when it comes to war and peace that he's been clear about, and is about the only American politician who is being clear about it.
No, I mean, I would say that the paper I referred to before by Michael J. Glennon has its flaws, and it's kind of like it requires that flaw in order for him to articulate what the nature of this Trumanite government is, but it does overestimate what the before and after was in terms of the way our Constitution operates. And of course, I did read the paper. I'm sure there's a precedent to what he's talking about. I forget, he goes back historically in terms of World War I, but usually, and I forget how he dealt with this, but usually the rise of this national security state certainly can be traced to World War I, but it really can be traced to the Civil War and after the Civil War. And in fact, it could probably be traced to before then. In fact, good historians could probably trace it back to some things that Washington and Jefferson said about the destiny of the United States and its role in the world. As soon as we committed ourselves to that destiny, we quote unquote committed ourselves to that destiny, and kind of dressed up this manifest destiny and economic imperialism in terms of America's mission, America's godly mission to the world, then the Madisonian, whatever the Madisonian Constitution might have offered, began to be pretty compromised in terms of the powers of the president, and then beyond that, especially after World War II, the powers of this national security state and this military establishment and this kind of wise men approach to foreign policy that is sort of symbolized by the Council of Foreign Relations and all of these people that you have writing on the op-ed pages, and this kind of shadow government of these people who, no matter how wrong they are, keep coming back to comment the next time. And that's another thing that's been pointed out, that all these people that were so wrong, from Bill Kristol to Thomas Friedman, are now being asked about this. Why are they being asked about this? Because it never hurts to be wrong. There's never any consequences for being wrong when it comes to foreign policy, because in a sense they weren't really wrong. Iraq was, invading Iraq was the foreign policy.
Exactly. That's absolutely right. Chomsky has pointed out that both Washington and Jefferson speak of empire, speak of the new United States as an empire, with the notion that that empire included expansion not only into the rest of the North American continent, but also into the Caribbean and Central America and South America even, and that this is being thought about already by the ruling class in America at the end of the 18th century. So there is, as usual on these things, a remarkable continuity. They've learned nothing and forgotten nothing. And it seems to me that the concerns of the American government, the actual policy of the American government, the foreign policy and also the domestic policy of the American government, needs to be described, because the propaganda cover is the most sophisticated in human history. The U.S. discovered, particularly perhaps in the Wilson administration in the First World War, the necessity of controlling a population not by police, although they were perfectly happy to do that too, but that wasn't effective enough. they had to change the public mind. They had to mold the public mind to do what they wanted to do, which was not, in fact, in the interest of the public, but in the interest of the very few, those same New York bankers who wanted to get the U.S. into the war. So the Wilson administration was an exercise in pretending to Americans that Wilson kept us out of war, his campaign slogan for 1916, while he was arranging for, in the interest of the 1%, the U.S. to get involved in the European war. I mean, you can call it Trumanite presidency if you want. If the word Wilsonian had not been used for propaganda purposes for something else, it would work just as well.
Yeah.
So the continuity here is quite remarkable. Chomsky says someplace, that's the reason people don't study history, he says. It just teaches you too much.
Chomsky, of course, is giving a lot of talks, as he always is, and there's a lot of overlap on the talks he gives, but he gave a recent one. He updates it according to the current events, and I think he gave an hour-long talk in Durham, England recently, which you can watch on YouTube, which I think summarizes a lot of the things that we've been saying and updates it. And I think he's, at 85 years old, at the top of his game. Yeah. And,
very true.
You know, how, a lot can be said about that. But it really is, even if you've watched and read and listened to a lot of Chomsky, I think the manner in which he summarizes, the oldies but goodies and the new twists and turns is quite remarkable. And there was a question and answer session following this, in which also was quite informative. So that's what he's been up to.
And you're watching News from Neptune, which is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. Carl Estabrook and David Green talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media, which has not, for the most part, been very edifying. I should mention that while David has been reading serious academic papers on American foreign policy and history, I've been going to the movies. And I've seen a couple of movies, interestingly, that turn out to have relevance to the sorts of things we're talking about. I've thought for a while that the poets often get there first, even if they don't quite understand where they've got to. And I saw a couple of strangely disparate movies in the last week that seem, at least to me, to be an example of this. The first was a Jim Jarmusch vampire picture, Only Lovers Left Alive. Now, there are good reasons to go see this picture. Jarmusch is an atmospheric filmmaker who does a lot of interesting things with his films. The images live in your head. And he has the wonderful Tilda Swinton as his lead in this movie, and she is quite wonderful. But the movie itself, strangely, odd soap opera, which is basically what it is, the life and times, the family troubles of a group of vampires. This vampire soap opera turns out to be set in Detroit, largely. And Detroit is a major actor in the picture. Jarmusch doesn't talk about it much. He is not really a political filmmaker straight up. But as the English critic Terry Eagleton has pointed out in his book on Jarmusch, there's a subtext here, a political subtext here, that's in some ways one of the most radical subtexts of contemporary film in contemporary films. Detroit and the destruction of Detroit seems to illustrate Marx's remark about vampire capital. I don't even know if Jarmusch knows the quote, but he might from hanging out with Eagleton, if nothing more. And the picture of Detroit as sort of the victim of much greater vampires than Tilda Swinton and her lover in the picture comes across quite remarkably and quite subliminally. It's a remarkable picture in that way. The other picture that I saw is even more peculiar, and it has a subtext that resonates now in ways that I think it would not have 20 years ago. Ivan Reitman made a movie called Dave 20 years ago, starring Sigourney Weaver and
Kevin Kline, I think.
thank you, Kevin Kline. Kevin Kline plays a look-alike for an American president. This is long before Kevin Spacey and the wonderful series on Netflix right now, which I love the fact the Chinese government has been using, what's the Kevin Spacey thing called?
That I can't help you
No.
with.
You know, Jason, don't you? Yeah. Oh, well, in any case, it'll come to me in a moment.
Yeah.
The Chinese government has been using this has been jumping up and down with glee for months now. See, look, this is how corrupt the American government is. Here we find it in this American television series. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a germ. I mean, the Chinese are having too much fun with it, but there's a germ of truth in what they say. Once again, the poets have got there first in. What can I think of the name of this? You know the name, don't you? And you're looking and laughing at me for forgetting it, but. For that very reason, I'll go on referring to it as this Kevin Spacey things.
We're having our first House of Cards.
Our omniscient director comes through again. He's talking about House. We're talking about
Oh,
House
I knew
of
that.
Cards.
I just didn't realize that's what you were getting at.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard of it.
Well, it's very much worth seeing, I think, and so and that's what the Chinese government thinks too, because they think that it gives an accurate portrait of the U.S. government. I'm not sure they're wrong, but I was actually talking about an earlier and in some ways more innocent picture, Ivan Reitman's movie about a look-alike for the president who takes the president's place after he has a stroke. This is this is from Clinton times, so the president has a stroke while he's with a bimbo, and therefore they can't mention that, and okay. They have to run Dave, the character played by Kevin Kline, into the White House as the president, and hilarity ensues. But in the meantime, some interesting politics ensue too. There is a really brilliant performance by Frank Langella as the president's chief of staff, once again all too recognizable from the Clinton years, but still in all, the innovation that the fake president makes when he realizes that he can get away with doing things that actually help people is a program of job creation. He establishes a program or a set of programs to get a job for anybody who needs a job. And this, of course,
Where have I heard that before?
Well, exactly. I thought it might remind you of maybe some local candidates.
The good old days.
David Green ran for Congress here in
the other
Illinois.
the other Dave.
The other Dave, right? Yes, the Dave theme here is worthwhile because, of course, one of the things that David was talking about is running for president is the remarkable and, for the most part, unremarked situation where Barack Obama is elected president in part because people thought he would do something about the job crisis, the Great Recession. Of course, he hasn't, because he was working for people who are, in effect, profiting from the Great Recession, the American 1%, and therefore he can make only token moves to change it in any way. And we are given each month a careful consideration of how maybe a 0.1% change in the unemployment rate represents the success of the Obama policies. The point here is that in this fantasy from 20 years ago, the obvious problem of American politics was addressed directly with the obvious solution. If we listen to the people who write on the editorial pages of the News Gazette or the New York Times, these are deep and profound questions that only people of the greatest intelligence and preparation can possibly deal with. This is absolute nonsense. These are lies they're telling us in order to cover over the profits of the 1% and a polity and an economy that are being run for their interests. Their great fear, the great fear of the administration and indeed of the political class as a whole is that people will find out. people will find out that this is the case. And so we hear interesting, if finally quite disturbing things about the vast transfer of military equipment to local police departments around the country, of preparations, peculiar preparations by American government agencies and departments across the board, the possibility of civil disorder. Civil disorder seems to mean people demanding the government do what they're supposed to do, end the war and provide jobs. This week we had another example of deja vu here, perhaps. Story, of course, appearing not in the American press but in the foreign press, of the U.S. government, in this case the Pentagon, no surprise, running a program that transferred large amounts of money to American universities to study how revolting people can be kept in place. How civil disorder can be managed, how the potentiality of Americans and others around the world to recognize the real situation they're living in rather than the government-approved propaganda account might lead to objections to that situation, indeed objections that would include public demonstrations and civil disorder. The University of Wisconsin, I think, wasn't it? Minnesota, several others. And given the nature of the program, I'm sure that the university system made sure that no applicants would be turned away, would be studying this problem that the U.S. government faced, basically the problem of how to control its own population when that population should possibly discover the government wasn't working in their interests. One of the few places that I've seen this written about was on the excellent Black Agenda report, which Bruce Dixon and Glenn Ford and others produce as radio talks and as written columns. I recommend it highly. There's a good article on this Project Minerva that the Pentagon is running right now. Minerva, the goddess of war, in order to control
is she the goddess of war or of wisdom?
Both, actually.
Oh, okay.
A goddess of war, a goddess of wisdom.
Well, I didn't know about
Minerva.
The war. I didn't know about the war business.
Well,
I'm
you know,
not
she's
a
always
student of mythology, but
she's presented in breastplate and armor and a spear and so forth. Athena.
But I wanted to say this is a more prosaic segue from this, but I think it's relevant.
Hell, look, I'm talking about popular movies.
Yeah, right. No, but I think one of the things that people can't find out about is money and the nature of money. And I've been becoming more aware recently of this movement called modern monetary theory. They're a group of people who are not at Yale or Harvard or Princeton or the University of Chicago or Stanford, but that are at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, not even the University of Missouri, Columbia, but Kansas City, economists that we hear about, like Michael Hudson and Bill Black, who have cogent critiques of the way our financial and monetary and economic systems work. You don't hear much about them unless you read Counterpunch or unless you go to the specific websites in which their work and the work of their colleagues and a few other people around the country in this modern monetary theory, which has been evolving quite rapidly over the last 20, 30 years, based on the work of some people like Hyman Minsky and others, sort of post-Keynesian and post-Keynesian economists. But it's really quite compelling work. It is not Marxist work, and they don't deal that seriously with the notion of social class, but what they do is dispel all this mystification around where money comes from. And it turns out that a lot of way of controlling people, of course we're controlled through debt, but the question is, who are these debts owed to? And how does the government, meaning the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and so forth, deal with these debts? How does the government borrow money? How does the banking system work? And I think what these people have done, and what have done a really good job at, for all the lack of attention that they get in the mainstream media, for being basically sensible economists and not Marxists, telling us this is how capitalism could work if we understood the fact that we are a sovereign state, we have a fiat currency, and we can print money and we can put people to work. And that's really what it amounts to. And if people ever find out, I think what they're saying is true, and if people ever start to find out about it, there's a lot of things that people could find out about that would make them really angry. But I think fundamental is keeping people in the dark about this idea of government debt and the government powers to print currency. What I started saying during my campaign, even before I'd sort of explored this background, what I started saying during my campaign was, it doesn't make any sense that people produce the wealth of this country, and it doesn't make any sense to say that we can't afford to put people to work producing the wealth of this country. And I think that's what all this this modern monetary theory is really getting at.
And I've had more sense on that, except what you just said, from a 20-year-old movie that was meant as a comedy than anything that's being said publicly about this right now, saving your presence.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing seems to me right now is that what the Obama administration, and indeed the American government in general, fears is that these things will get out, that people will begin understanding what it's actually doing when it's killing people in the Middle East. People will start understanding what it's actually doing when it's, quote, regulating the economy, close quote, and how different things could be done if there is a demand, for changes in that. It's nothing new. I think it's fair to say that Barack Obama became president because Americans thought he would end the war and provide jobs. And his task has been to convince Americans why he can't do those things. Or, worse yet, convince Americans he is doing those things, but hey, it'll just take time. Now, this sort of covering sin with smooth names is what he's good at and what he's been at all along. But the danger that he's nobody's dummy, he quite understands, is that the facade will get stripped away, that it won't work.
I heard Lawrence Tribe say in an interview the other day that Barack Obama was the best student that he ever had. And I'm not sure. I think he didn't mean that in an ironic sense, but he is critical of Obama, but not in quite the sense that you're talking about.
Yeah. That makes me wonder a little more about Larry Tribe's own suggestions of what constitutes a good student, things that he wanted to do, perhaps.
I wasn't bowled over by this interview with Lawrence Tribe.
I didn't see the interview.
I'll refer it to you. He was interviewed on a radio program called This Is Hell, which comes out of Northwestern, comes out of the radio station at Northwestern, which you can access online. There's a lot better interviews on that program than the one the host of that show did with Lawrence Tribe, but it was talking about the Constitution and the powers of the president. And it had a lot to do with campaign finance and the Supreme Court and so forth. So, anyway,
it does seem to me, though, that the issues, and indeed the issues you started with about the sort of two conceptions of government or two conceptions of executive authority in the government, which was really what the paper was about, are very much on the table these days. I think the great fear in Washington is that the public will begin to understand that what they want is not what the government in power wants, and they'll look for change. Now, we see some of this right now in the real mood for impeachment in this country that's being encouraged by some political elements in the country of a different faction from the Obama administration. And that's been engineered around Obamacare and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, however misconstrued or misunderstood those demands are, or how much they're based on misunderstanding, the demands are there. There's a sense in the body politic that the government is not working for them, working for somebody else. And at the extreme ends, this becomes the sort of conspiracist thought Obama is really a Muslim, he really wants to impose Sharia law, things like that. But I mean, it's a case where the sleep of reason produces monsters. That is, the reason that would analyze what the U.S. government is actually doing, what the Obama administration is actually doing, is misperceived and misunderstood, but the concerns are still there. And the administration is worried that the concerns could become clearer, more common, and more specific in their demands for change. That's what they've got to avoid. That's what campaigns like Ready for Hillary are in the business of doing. They're trying to tell you that those things that you might be concerned about, don't really be concerned about them, because after all, we're all set. We got the fix. We got the way to do it.
I mean, I would just add that I mean, I think we are experiencing kind of a golden age of economic analysis, which is kind of symbolized by the Piketty phenomenon.
Absolutely.
But there's lots of stuff, including what I just mentioned about monetary theory, from Keynesian to Marxist theory, that is really pulling the veil from what, from banking and finance and austerity policies. And the question is how these ideas can filter down, or could be presented to the common consciousness, to the broad consciousness in a way that people can understand. I just think it's important. It's what it's what I'm all about right now in terms of political activism. I don't see the point of doing anything except trying to explain to people how this economic system really works.
I think you're absolutely right.
Having people do that.
I think that's true. And part of that is realizing that the business of our political class is to keep that veil in place.
Absolutely.
To make sure that those things are not seen. And that's that's why you come here and listen to us, right? Because we talk about the things that they won't talk about in Washington. Our job is to exist outside the limits of allowable debate. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 25th week of 2014, the Midsummer Eves edition. And most of the sprites and fairies that we've been talking about inhabit the national government, so be aware. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussion tonight has been David Green. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page as well. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake and Jason. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.